Hi, my name is cjrhen, and today I'm going to be covering the improvements Dorico made to their pitch before duration to give it some feature parity with Finale Speedy no input. The developers of Dorico introduced these new features because they want to give a warm welcome to all the new Finale users switching over to Dorico and make improvements to the software that will benefit all the users, all while helping preserve previous Finale users' workflows and all the skills they have developed over the years using Finale. I've talked in my previous videos about how Dorico is generally very receptive of user feature requests and that they strive to make this software work best for us, and I think this is a prime example of the type of community and support you can expect being a Dorico user. Before I dive into showing off the new features, how it works, and how it might impact my workflow as a Dorico user, I want to mention my last video I released last week, which is on the screen, which is about voice crossing in big band writing. I talk about working with the brass section, but I also talk about dealing with repeated notes and why voice crossing is a good technique to mitigate the amount of repeated notes. I got that concept from Jay Chataway, who was an arranger for Maynard Ferguson, and he's been a great mentor to me and given me some great tips, and I thought it'd be awesome to be able to share some of that with you all. If you want to show your support, subscribe, hit that bell, and leave a like, and let's get on with the video. To get started, we have to understand Dorico by default wants the rhythm before the note, but if you want to change that to be more in line with Speedy no input, you have the ability to do that in the preferences. The Dorico team actually released a short video on this, but I'll just quickly recap it. Hit J to open your jump bar, and from here we can type in anything we want, so we don't actually have to know all our individual key commands or navigate with our mouse. Type in preferences, and just click enter to get to my preferences and navigate to no input in editing. I will not be changing any of these settings for me personally because I prefer to work with a MIDI keyboard and entering my rhythm before, but if you choose to, you can set it so you always enter the pitch before the duration by default, and you can also change when you enter accidentals, rhythm dots to make dotted notes, and articulations for all the notes you're inputting. Note that I had a viewer who actually set after inputting note and then realized the behavior was a little different than he was expecting, because if it's set to before inputting note, when you input a series of notes and you have your staccato on, it puts it on for all those notes as long as you're inserting notes, but that does not apply if you have it to after inputting note. You have to do it on a note by note basis. Let me show you what I mean by that before I show you the new features. If I have it to setting the articulation before my note input, if I'm in note input mode and I turn on something like staccato and then I enter a series of notes, all of them will have staccatos. This is in contrast to having this setting set to after inputting note. Watch now as I enter no input mode. I have my quarter note selected and I input an F. Now I want to put my staccato on it. I do it after the fact since I have that setting enabled, but if I input another note after that, it doesn't carry that over. Now I have to do it on a note by note basis. All that is to say, it's absolutely just a personal preference, and my personal preference is to be able to insert multiple articulations in a row because that generally goes along with my workflow. Now let's dive into showing you how to work with the updated pitch before duration. I am going to start inputting notes, click Shift N to engage no input mode, and now I will click K to enter pitch before duration. From this point forward in the video, I want to be clear, I have it set so I put my articulations, my dotted notes, in my accidentals in before I actually select the duration. So the feature that was added was being able to use the Alt and Up key or Down key to use a shadow note so you can see what note is going to get input without needing to select a specific note on your keyboard with the note name or using a MIDI keyboard. If you do that, it won't automatically give you the shadow note. You have to select a note first, any note. I just press F because that's almost always where my index finger is, and from here you can hold Alt and the arrow keys to move the shadow note around. You can also remap that so you don't need to use the Alt key. It's just set that way by default for Dorico users who prefer the typical way of doing this. The beauty of Dorico in this update is you now have the freedom to choose how you want that to work. From this point, I'm just going to put a descending F major scale, and I will do this in quarter notes. To do this now with our method of being able to use the Alt key, I have the F shown as my shadow note. I'll click 6. Then I can use the arrow and Alt key, and again, you can change that to go to a different note, and once again, enter my rhythm for that note. Notice with that note, it actually adjusted it to follow the key that was set. You may notice I'm struggling a fair bit, but that's because I'm doing everything backwards from the way I'm used to doing it. I think this is why this is such a great feature Dorico is adding, because there are users who would have had to unlearn 30 plus years of key commands in their head and just being able to work with this, versus me coming from the other perspective. I can't imagine doing it this way all the time, but honestly, if I didn't have a MIDI keyboard accessible to me, I think this is a skill I need to develop, and it would actually prove more beneficial than trying to enter the note names directly with the correlating letter on my keyboard. So while now it's great that we have the option to pre-select our note using our arrow keys, I think there is still going to be a disconnect for some Finale users with the way rests in the grid work, but I'm going to show you how to preserve the ability to input rests, but we have to make a connection between how rests relate to the grid. So get into note input mode, make sure we have pitch before duration enabled, and I already selected some note that I want to input. Now we can select different notes using the Alt and up or down arrows. I'm going to go to a C. I'm going to make this a dotted note, and then I'm going to press 5 to make a dotted eighth note. Now let's say I want a full quarter note rest of duration. I can achieve this by pressing the comma, which now puts me in rest input mode. If I insert a quarter note duration of a rest, I'll press 6 for a quarter note. Notice what it did is it didn't actually draw a rest yet, but it did move my note input caret to the correct spot that is correlating to that rest being there. Now, if I input a note, I want to back out of the rest input mode, clicking the comma again. I need to engage some note, such as D on my keyboard. I can use the Alt and the arrow keys to navigate to different notes, and now I can select any duration because we're in pitch before duration, and it will input that value. I'll put a 16th note just so it lines up metrically. Once I do that, it goes in and fills in the value for the rest that I actually inserted. What ultimately is happening is, even though you can insert any arbitrary value of a rest, it still is coming back to the grid system. The grid system in Dorico is your friend. Try to find a way to embrace the grid system, even though it's somewhat of a foreign concept, especially if you're coming from Finale or Sibelius. Now that we covered the basics of pitch before duration and the updated features using the arrow key with shadow notes, which gives us some feature parity to Finale, I want to discuss some of the advantages for Dorico users, why we want to use this system, especially if we don't have access to a MIDI keyboard, and also one thing to think about if you have pitch before duration enabled by default. One of my earlier videos I made about quicker note input in Dorico really was based on the idea that I'm working on a MIDI keyboard. In my opinion, if I'm working with a MIDI keyboard, I always want to be inputting my rhythm before my note. That's just a personal preference, but if I don't have access to a MIDI keyboard and I'm working just on my laptop on the go, this would allow me to have two hands on the keyboard without having to move around and press different keys. Instead, I can just kind of lock in with the arrow keys, the Alt key, and just get some work done. I could imagine myself being able to put my laptop on my lap, even on a situation if I'm in a car or public transportation, and actually being able to work and not worry about losing grip in my laptop, all while being massively efficient in Dorico. The last piece of information I want to give is about having pitch before duration enabled, and notice what it does to your cursor by default. When pitch before duration is not on, by default our cursor is the select tool, but if you have pitch before duration on and you're wondering why it's always highlighting the staff with a shadow note, simply enable your select tool. With your select tool enabled, that's your default tool until you enter note input mode. I hope you enjoyed today's video in the shorter format. I was super excited to see this update come out and just see all the improvements that Dorico is inevitably going to be making with all these new users. We have a great community, and we have the opportunity to make the best notation software that could ever exist. I included a link in the description to the Dorico team's video about this feature that they added, and they talk a little more about the preferences and the key commands. I also included a link in the description to my last video, which was actually a compositional video and an arranging video talking about voice crossing, and a little tip I learned from prolific composer Jay Chataway, who arranged for Maynard Ferguson and also scored a lot of the Star Trek series. Please subscribe, hit that bell, leave a like, ask questions down in the comments. Thank you for your support. Thank you for watching my videos, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you.